Hey everyone! In this installment of the PrimateCast, an origin story from Dr. Robin Dunbar on how the social brain evolved.
Evolution,
communication,
cognition,
conservation,
behavior.
Primatology.
Typically primates.
Become the monkey.
Hi everyone, and once again, glad to have you back in the audience for this, the PrimateCast number 66, which is being released on Sunday, May the 22nd, 2022. I'm your host, Andrew McIntosh from Kyoto University's Wildlife Research Center, and today's podcast is taken from our International Primatology Lecture Series, Past, Present, and Future Perspectives of the Field. This is the brainchild of Dr. Michael Huffman, and like our normal programming, is brought to you by PsyCasp. The main goal of the lecture and this series is to share the origin stories of experienced practitioners in primatology and its allied fields. To do that, Mike Huffman has invited a revolving door of renowned primatologists to join us on the program and share their own stories with us. The PrimateCast is happy to be able to share these stories right here on the podcast, and we hope you enjoy them as much as we do. Now, unlike our normal interview format, these lectures are being done as part of the PsyCasp Seminar in Science Communication, which is aimed at graduate students here in the Primatology and Wildlife Science program at Kyoto University. So, what you'll hear is a lecture from each speaker that was recorded in Zoom, and who's generally also showing slides, so there may be some references to visual aids that are not available in podcast format. But for anyone wishing to see the speakers presenting their talks, we invite you to check out those on the PsyCasp YouTube channel. In the fourth podcast from this IPL series, we hear from Dr. Robin Dunbar, Professor Emeritus of Evolutionary Psychology at the University of Oxford. He's behind some of the most iconic ideas in the evolution of social cognition, including the social brain hypothesis, which basically posits that most of what we think of as accounting for advanced intelligence in humans and other animals comes from this phenomenon of being social. And secondly, what has become known as Dunbar's number, which is a way to quantify the maximum effective number of individuals with which an individual can maintain stable social relationships, based on our cognitive capabilities for tracking complex relationships among group members. And this has huge repercussions for group size and structure. So we hope that you enjoy this episode from our International Primatology Lecture Series, and we'll provide links to this and other lectures in our series in the show notes on the podcast website. As usual, here's Mike Huffman introducing Robin Dunbar to get us started.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. And welcome all of you to the fourth lecture in the series. And it's a great pleasure and an honor that we have Professor Robin Dunbar talking to us today, for us today. Some of you may not be aware, although you're all more than likely aware of the immense body of work that Robin has done. But in the early days of his career back in 1979, he was actually here at PRI for several months, working together with Professor Kawai and some of the researchers working with him in Ethiopia, studying the gelada baboons. And Robin was doing his studies at about the same time. So Professor Kawai invited him over to spend some months with the team, and several early papers came out of that work. But he was actually here on the fifth floor as a visiting scholar many years ago. I had heard about Robin's work for a long time before I actually met him. I think the first time we met was back in 1994 at Cambridge. There was a social learning conference, and we had a party in the evening. And Robin was sitting on in an area, this big open hall, nursing a glass of wine, as I was doing, standing, walking around, introducing myself and meeting people. And Robin called me over, and we set up a conversation, and then it was really a nice experience, and I think about that quite a bit. I was checking through Amazon today, just looking for books and things, and I came across Robin's long list of books, and I was amazed at the many different languages that his work has been translated into. Japanese, of course, for most of those books, I think. So for you students who are interested in looking for a role model for science communication, I think Robin is the best example we have in the field for his very prolific activity and scientific outreach to the public and professionals at many different levels. And I think we'll get to hear a little bit about those experiences and how that has impacted the science that he does. And so without any further ado, I'll let Robin do the rest of the talking, please.
Thank you very much, Mike. Let me just kind of give a quick pointer to what I think are the main messages that are going to come out of the talk. One is simply that discoveries in science are almost always accidents. They're never planned. And particularly in our end, very few of it. In physics, they can make very fine predictions from theory and it works. But I'm afraid at the level of field workers, or indeed most of the life sciences, this doesn't really happen. So they are just accidents. It's about being there at the right time and the right place for when the light bulb goes on, if you like. But I always feel for us field workers, really, just observation of the animals is absolutely crucial. If you don't kind of intuitively understand what it's like to be that animal, no matter what animal you're studying, then you never really understand the world that it lives in. In other words, you have to be able to sit inside the animal's skull, if you like, and see the world around it the way the animal sees it, and then be able to ask, why is that the case? And in the context of these why questions, sometimes known as Tinbergen's 4 whys, it's extremely important not to confuse causes with consequences and constraints, particularly in evolutionary analyses. And people do that all the time, I'm afraid, particularly in comparative analyses. There's a kind of oddity in the way I've gone about doing my research, I think, in that everybody, I guess, studies primates in order to understand humans. And I've always done the reverse. I've ended up doing a lot of things on humans, but it's actually in order to understand primates better, because there are things that we can do on humans that we cannot do on primates. And so the kind of slipping between different species like this, and also into other mammals, has been really quite important for the development of my ideas. And lastly, biology is a multidisciplinary discipline. It has many different layers to it, and you need to examine the different layers all the time. So, clearly function, evolutionary function, is the core to what most of us do, the why question, if you like. But you also need to understand the mechanisms, I think, to see how these functions are brought about in a particular case, because in understanding the mechanisms, we understand the evolutionary process. So those are the key messages. How did I get into this stuff? Well, I looking back now, in my old age, as they say, it's become obvious to me, which I didn't appreciate at the time, that my early life really was very important in allowing me to do what I did for a number of reasons. One is, I grew up in East Africa in this place called Tanga up here on the top right-hand corner of mainland Tanzania, Tanganyika as it was then. And I was very early on exposed to wildlife. So here I am, aged about 3, with a wild monkey sitting on our veranda. We lived among these animals all the time and got to know them very well. Here I am in age 17, I think, out in the bush hunting. This is actually an 1890s matchlock. Here's the powder horn. This is an extraordinary piece of equipment we found that these two guys had. Here's the powder horn. So this is a muzzle loading, push powder down the front end, then you stick a ball bearing down it, and you've got a matchlock here, like they had in the early 19th century. This is an old Arab rifle, basically. But we spent a lot of time walking around these kind of habitats, really understanding the nature of the habitat and how the animals lived in them. And also living up here in northern Tanzania is very close to Olduvai Gorge, the big area that the Leakeys really discovered in the early 60s, the Australopithecines, the East African Australopithecines. So these things were the talking point. People talked about these kind of discoveries all the time out there because they were there. So I was really very embedded into kind of human evolution stories, even in my childhood. And finally, I realize now, growing up in what was an extremely multicultural environment, was really very important because it allowed me to switch from one culture to another. I would consider myself a four-culture person, really, because although I clearly grew up and my family was as it were, British culture, British were rather few in number out there. In fact, there were probably more other Europeans in Tanganyika in particular than there were British, but also there's a very large number of Indians. We were very heavily embedded in the Indian community because my father was born and grew up in India. There was a big Arab culture because being on the coast and the trading for many centuries or 1,000 years probably. And then of course Swahili culture, and I was deeply embedded in Swahili culture to the point where I wrote poetry in Swahili in Arabic script, which is what they used in the 18th century. And this down here on the right, lower right, is one of my Swahili poems. I could no longer write now in Arabic script because it's about 50 years since I did it. But there we go. But these kind of environmental influences at a very young age, I think, allowed me to switch from being in one kind of cultural mindset to another. And that was very important in studying animals because you could easily move into their kind of mind state, if you like. So I started to study primates in particular as an undergraduate. I did 2 field studies as an undergraduate, one of baboons in Ethiopia, 1968, and one of baboons in Senegal the following year. And then I did my PhD. I did my PhD on these animals here, the gelada, with the Professor Kawai's group coming through in between our 2 visits. We just sort of overlapped up here in the neighboring ridges, really, up in the Simien Mountains in northern Ethiopia. So this is me here sitting in the middle of a gelada herd. But at the same time, I also worked on black and white colobus, not in this study site, but in another study site where they were very abundant, and we were working on gelada in a different area. And also klipspringer, which were extremely abundant up here. I first began to work on these. Later, I did a full-time study of them in Kenya in the 1980s. But these little monogamous antelopes are really very fascinating and very enlightening from that point of view, from understanding monogamy, I think, or obligatory monogamy in antelope. And then I spent a lot of time studying wild goats, feral goats in Scotland and in North Wales, right through really from the 1980s on and off through till about 2007, when I finally stopped doing field work. But in the meantime, I'd been working increasingly on humans. So the story of the social brain, it's interesting that in 1992, give or take a year, so I think the first paper was published in 1991 and the last of the series in 1993, but basically all the work was done around 1992. I had 4 ideas, which I thought at the time were unrelated to each other. They were the idea that time was more important than anything else for animals, and I spent a lot of time building time budget models, which we've gone on to do for I think we now have time budget models for 12 primate genera, all the great apes, most of all the African genera of monkeys, 1 South American genus of monkey, and feral goats, so 1 ungulate. And these really look at the constraints that time imposes on the time that animals have available for social interaction, therefore creating their social groups. At the same time, I started working on the social brain hypothesis. It came as an idle thought, actually. I was trying to solve the problem of why primates spend so much time grooming, which I believed was a bonding mechanism, not just hygiene, although it obviously does clean the fur, but the real purpose was bonding. And I was trying to think of ways of testing that hypothesis, and the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis had recently been proposed. And I thought, well, if grooming has main function is social bonding, then there ought to be a three-way correlation between grooming time, brain size, and social group size. And slightly to my surprise, there was. And there was this very tight relationship, relatively speaking, between group size and brain size. And that set me off thinking about the social brain hypothesis. This whole issue of grooming as a bonding mechanism, and particularly the neuropsychological mechanism or neurophysiological mechanisms that underpin grooming as a bonding mechanism, that it also gave rise to the gossip theory of language, if you like. And then finally Dunbar's number, which spawned perhaps more ideas than anything else. So I think my most entertaining consequence of Dunbar's number is there is a software, an internet silent handshake security mechanism known as Facebook, which was developed off the back of it. But there are also two bot detection mechanisms that are based on Dunbar's number and the fractal structuring of social relationships, on the grounds that bots don't have natural social networks and only humans do. And those bot detection mechanisms are actually more successful at detecting bots than all the other mechanisms, algorithms that had been developed. But anyway, roughly speaking, these various four different things have produced a huge number of papers, really, but most of them are now collaborative papers with other people. You can see the number, but what I came to realize in the end was that these four are actually four legs of the same story. They're the four legs on which social evolution really in primates in particular, but mammals in general, but primates in particular, are based. Okay, so back to the social brain. What's it all about? Well, it seemed to me we have three things to explain here. One is, why do primates have bigger brains than all other animals, and particularly other mammals? And is it really the case that primates need a big brain to find food? Are they ecologically smart, really smarter than squirrels, which are probably among the smartest of the, if you like, the lower mammals, as we might think of them? Secondly, why do primates have absolutely bigger brains, or why do some primate species have absolutely bigger brains than other primate species? So why do chimpanzees, for example, have bigger brains than monkeys, and why do monkeys have bigger brains than, let's say, some of the prosimians? And then finally, why do we find certain specialized areas in the primate brain which we don't find in other species? And the two most important are probably this point here, what's known as the frontal pole, or Brodmann area 10, which is unique to anthropoid primates. The prosimians don't have it, and the callitrichids don't have it either in the South American monkeys, but all the other anthropoid primates have this area. It's what allows them to do causal reasoning. It's what allows them to do analogical reasoning, one-trial learning, and inhibition. It's what allows them to inhibit. And we've come to see inhibition as crucial for living in social groups, because you have to be able to inhibit your natural tendency to want to take the big slice of the cake. This is, if you like, the evolution of politeness in monkeys and apes, and of course humans. So this capacity to allow somebody else to have some share of the benefits of living in the group without trying to steal all the benefits is crucial to keeping or allowing a group to keep together. And that's the problem they have. It's enabling the group to remain together as a single unit to provide the function that's necessary for the animals. And then the other key anatomical thing is this so-called mentalizing network, which is this huge chunk connected by a massive, great white matter wiring, if you like, which involves the prefrontal cortex up here, including the frontal pole, the temporal parietal junction up in here, and the temporal lobe here. And we've seen since come to realize that this is also deeply connected into what's known as the default mode network, which goes from up here in the prefrontal cortex into the limbic system down behind here somewhere. So you have this sort of hugely complex system, and that turns out to be fundamentally important for social reasoning, basically. And monkeys, at least macaques, where the primate work has been done, and humans have exactly the same system. Okay, so here's the original analysis I did on the social brain hypothesis, plotting mean group size for a species against neocortex ratio, just putting a regression line, but this is not the conventional least squares regression line, which will run across here at a much lower angle because of the scatter in the data, but using a reduced major axis regression, which tends to put the line up the center of the tube of data, as it were, is the one I used. And I had the idea, and this was probably something like 3 o'clock in the morning after a long night analyzing this, to ask, well, what happens to humans? We have humans in this same database. We can plug them in. Oh, and by the way, we showed later that this quantitative relationship only applies to primates. It does not apply to mammals, other mammals in general, and it doesn't apply to birds either, where the same principle applies. There's still a social brain hypothesis, but it's not a quantitative relationship between group size and neocortex ratio. It's simply a reflection of monogamous systems. In all these other species, monogamous species have bigger brains than polygamous species, but that's the end of it, with the possible exception of the dolphin whale family. But if we plug humans in, we get a prediction of that of about 150. That's the number that's become known as Dunbar's number. Does it exist? Well, the answer is yes, surprisingly. I was a bit doubtful. I thought it was much too small a number for humans, but actually we and other people have spent the last 30 years testing this in many different contexts, and we come up with a value of 150 consistently over and over again. So here's one data set of ours. This is a national cell phone data set from one large country. So there are 6 million subscribers in here. It's based on 6 billion calls over the course of a year. We take reciprocated calls as indicative of a relationship. So you have to call back to the same number at some point, otherwise it doesn't count as a relationship. And when you look at that, you get a nice bell-shaped curve. The sort of green smear is all these 6 million subscribers squashed in there, but the mean is right above 150. And here's an analysis of number of friends on Facebook by Stephen Wolfram, who's a kind of major analyst of online and Facebook in particular data. This is his data, nothing to do with me. He did this long before, or at least completely independently of the social brain hypothesis and Dunbar's number. This is the distribution of the number of friends on Facebook for 1 million Facebook users. And the peak here, he said the modal value is between 150 and 250, which is good enough for me, particularly as given the age group, because we now know that although the average is 150, the range is from about 100 to 250. And younger people, who are the main Facebook users, tend to be at the top end. So this is where you'd expect it to be. But I just discovered this paper was actually published 10 years ago, and I never noticed it. But there's a very nice analysis. It was actually a very infamous experiment done on Facebook, which caused a lot of row and attack by people because of the way they'd manipulated people's feeds. But buried in there is an estimate of the size, the mean size of the number of friends on Facebook. And this sample is 61 million Facebook users, and the mean is 149. Thank you. It doesn't come any better than that. I'm quite happy. But we also know now actually that 150 is what the mathematicians would call an attractor. It's a point where, if you like, the system is drawn to because of some feature of the system. And that feature is information flow. So we published a paper last year with some physicists showing that if you look at the structure of actual social networks in humans, the flow of information through the network is actually optimized at a size of 150. It sort of converges to that point. So at this point here, at exactly 150, the system collapses and goes back to kind of random processes. It's probably because the system fragments at that point and you no longer have an integrated network or community. But the fact that it does this suggests that there's either a cognitive limit or a time limit or both, and both is probably the answer is. However, here we are living in social groups along with all the other primates of a particular size. The problem for all mammals is that living in groups has costs, and those costs we usually think of in terms of day journey length and competition for food, these kind of things. But actually, it turns out that this is much less problematic for them, and we've literally only just discovered this. The paper showing it is not yet, is still in the review process, is that living in groups destroys female fertility. And it seems to be a consequence of stress created amongst the females themselves, because there's a positive effect on fertility of group size, which is why they live in groups. But there's a negative effect of the number of females in the group, which is the cost. And it is so strong in mammals in general that mammals cannot live in groups bigger than 5 to 7 females. It simply can't be done. That sets an upper limit on group size for mammals in general at about 15, which is exactly what you see, except in the herding species, which is one way of solving this problem. Primates, however, have gone in a different direction, and that is using bonded coalitions to buffer themselves against these stresses, and so allow themselves to live in large bonded groups. But here are the kinds of stresses. Here are some of our gelada, one harem here, squabbling with another harem over here. These are the Kashima Japanese macaques. And you can see here's the dominant male going off towards this lady here because he knows very well that she has peanuts in her pocket. She always does for them. But everybody else, look what they're doing. They're all watching him, and these ones are moving out of his way. They know what's going to happen. They don't want to be in the way. So this is all these kind of small level stressful things, sometimes big level stressful things, are just a constant problem that you have to cope with. And we can see this or the response to this really in terms of bonded social groups. So this is an analysis that Suzanne Schultz did some years ago, in which she looked at the rate of brain evolution over geological time since the first appearance of the order. So this is over 60 million years for primates, 20 million years for ruminants, and so on. How fast did brain size grow over time, and what proportion of that order's living species have bonded social groups? And you can see there's a very tight, actually, linear correlation between these two. Anthropoids sit right at the top. Prosimians are way down. They're not in the same league as anthropoids. In fact, the camelids, the camels and alpacas and so on, do better, as do the equid family, the horses, zebras, and the dolphins. But some species, the cats, the ruminant antelopes and deer, the dog family, don't have bonded social groups in this kind of way. This is how these species have solved the stresses of living in large groups, and the anthropoids have really come out right on the top. So what are they doing? How are they doing this? It's become clear to me over the years that what's going on here is what psychologists would call a two-process mechanism. It should say a two-process mechanism but it's being cut off, I'm afraid. That the mechanism used in creating social bonds in primates uses two separate processes which have different neural pathways in the brain, but which support each other. So they work in tandem. One is this stuff here, social grooming, or just physical touch, stroking in the case of humans, but social grooming in the case of primates. And this creates an emotionally very intense basis or platform off which to build relationships. And it does that through the endorphin system in the brain. And the second component is a cognitive component. It's given that they are able to spend a lot of time with each other, then they can build, what they're doing in effect is building cognitive relationships of trust and obligation and reciprocity. And I'll just go through each of those very quickly. The endorphin system in the brain turns out to be really interesting and much more important in social context than any of the other neurohormones that everybody gets excited about. This is I mean, we know from the primate research from other people that grooming, and several different labs, that grooming triggers the release of endorphins in the brain. So along with my collaborators in Finland, Lauri Numenmaa and his lab, we ran a bunch of humans through PET scanning, which is pretty nasty stuff, which we had a partner of the person just lightly stroking the torso, the chest and stomach while the person was in the scanner. And here are the brains lighting up, just going crazy, absorbing endorphins that have been triggered by a light so stroking. And this is done through a very specialized neural system, the C-tactile neural system, or more correctly, the afferent C-tactile neural system, because it has no return loop. It differs from the usual pain type peripheral nerves in that it's only one way. There's no return loop, motor loop back down to the thing. It responds to only one. It's very slow because it's unmyelinated, and it responds only to one stimulus and one stimulus only, and that's light slow stroking at exactly 2.5 centimeters per second. And that's the speed of hand movements during grooming as the animal pushes the fur aside to look at the skin surface beneath, as it were. If you stroke slower or faster than that, the neurons do not respond. And although this is a mammal-wide effect, it's really exploited heavily only by the primates, and some other species. For example, the horses do a lot of grooming with each other. The problem with grooming is it's kind of very limited in who you can do it with. You can only groom one person at a time. So that really imposes a limit on the number of individuals you can groom with, and therefore the size of group you can have. And we were interested in how humans really got above the limits that we see on group size in primates, which is around about 50 animals. How do we get up to 150? And we estimate from the various equations how much grooming time you would expect of all the fossil humans here. These are not modern, well, the blue line is what you'd expect to see in modern humans if we just bonded all our relationships by grooming, but these modern humans here are actually fossil modern humans. So it's taking the brain sizes, calculating group size from that, and then calculating grooming time from that using the equations relating these variables. And you can see it's going up here, but we have this big gap because nobody, including humans, modern humans, spends more than 20% of their day engaged in social interaction. And what we now think has happened is at various stages during this time, we've introduced new and more ways of triggering the endorphin system. The oldest is laughter. It's something we share with great apes in particular, and it's very visceral. So it's involuntary. We can't stop laughing if everybody else laughs. It's kind of like a form of chorusing, a bit like howler monkey chorusing, polite, quiet howler monkey chorusing, singing without words, so humming if you like, and dancing. And then after the appearance of language, which is very late in human evolution, we get the rituals of religion, feasting together, eating and drinking of alcohol together, and storytelling. And we now know because let's just say these 3 blocks we think come in to allow these uplifts at these 3 particular points. But we now know that all of these trigger the endorphin system, and more importantly, they increase the bonding, sense of bonding to the people you do these activities with. They don't change your sense of bonding to the people who are not there. Even your best friend is a very specific lead to the people you're actually engaged in this activity with. So these are the sort of attempts by our ancestors, if you like, to increase the size of the group we live in, or they lived in, using the same basic neurobiological mechanism, but having found out, if you like, and this is certainly historical, these are things we've learned. This is probably genetic, but these are all things we've learned how to do. We've learned how to trigger the endorphin system with a lot of people simultaneously, which overcomes the constraints of physical grooming. We've done an awful lot of work on neuroimaging in collaboration with various people, but since, in addition, so have other people from other labs. There's about a dozen neuroimaging studies now of individual humans, which has shown that the size of your personal social network correlates in particular with the size of the mentalizing network in particular, but also especially so the prefrontal cortex up here. And there's Brodmann's area 10, the frontal pole up in here as part of that. But we also now know from other people's work that the default mode network is part of that system. So there's this huge complex, it's a massive, massive neural loop, as it were, connected by huge fiber pathways. And it seems not to matter how you measure the social network. So we've often used just the inner core of the network. Other people have used the Facebook number of friends on Facebook. I think the prize goes to these guys, Kwak et al., who sampled a complete Korean village, everybody in the village, and then for their social networks, and use the incoming likes, if you like, to estimate the number of friends that somebody's had. So rather than asking you how many friends do you have, they ask how many people think you are a friend of theirs. And that's your friendship number. And then they scan the brains of a large proportion of these villagers and showed that, again, this big loop here in the mentalizing network correlates with the number of friends you have. And two labs have now done the same for macaques and baboons. So this is Jerome Saleh's study of captive macaques, and this is the French group that have looked at semi-free ranging baboons. So, and essentially the same thing. Well, in their case, they looked at total brain volume. The animals that lived in bigger groups within these captive colony had bigger brains. Jerome Saleh looked at the actual size of different brain units and showed that the size of individual social networks, if you like, correlate with the size of key brain regions, and particularly those that are associated again with the mentalizing circuit. So the other big part of the story, which has taken us a long, this has actually taken me 25 years to show that this is the case. I first realized the issue, if you like, in 1993, and I said so in print in 1993. We have only just published. In fact, the paper showing it was finally in print today. I got an email from the journal. But whenever anybody looks at the social brain data, the group size to brain size relationships in primates, they assume it's a single data set. But when you look at who these species are, it becomes very obvious that this is not so. And in fact, what we've now been able to show, and the problem with showing this statistically was the big problem, is that this apparently single set of data really consists of 4 grades, 4 separate grades. There's a bunch of of relatively unsocial primates out here. There's a bunch of very social primates, which are mainly great apes out here. And then in between are kind of two separate layers of increasingly intensely social primates. So this is, and what's interesting about these is these are not taxonomic. It cuts across taxonomy completely. Yes, these are prosimians, but these are South American monkeys. In these grades here, you've got a complete scatter of prosimians, South American monkeys, old world monkeys, and occasionally the odd ape in some of the data sets. And mostly these are apes in this data set. And there's humans up here sitting on this, essentially sitting on this fourth most intensely social grade line. Now, the interesting thing is we've been able now, this is Stefan's original data set, but we've got more data sets available now. So we've been able to do exactly the same analysis on altogether 5 different measures of brain size, if you like, from 4 different compilations of brain data in primates. These are cranial volume data. This is Navaret's recently published neocortex volume data. This is non-visual neocortex, so it's a sort of frontal end of primates from Stefan's database, and this is frontal lobe volume from the Rilling database. And all of these show the same patterns. And what I kind of want to draw your attention to is how tightly these values sit around these grades. They really aren't scattered. But these grades differ in brain size, in group size, and differ significantly in this respect in bondedness, the proportion of bonded species with bonded social systems, in measures of social cognition, and the 2 we use are mentalizing and inhibition, and finally in habitat predator risk. So what seems to be happening is as primates are invading more and more predator risky habitats, they're being pushed along this dimension here to develop bigger groups, but in order to develop bigger groups, they're having to develop the kind of behavioral and cognitive mechanisms that allow them to hold those groups together so they don't become dispersed. And that is why you get this relationship between group size and brain size. And this kind of emerging out of this really was, and I guess we first showed this in humans. We hadn't kind of anticipated it at all, but it just came out of the looking at human social networks. But all primates have a fractal structure to their social groups. And by fractal structure, I mean a picture that looks a bit like this. You've got all the individuals here, and they gather together in different grouping levels, with the grouping levels themselves gathering into higher grouping levels. So you've got several individuals here, let's say, that form a coalition. They groom a lot together, they protect each other, they help each other out, if you like. And then several coalitions make up a reproductive unit, a harem. Several harems make up a team. Several teams make up a band, and several bands make up a community. And this was first published in one of our very early papers with Kawai Sensei, as a result of that visit I made to PRI back in 1979. Okay, so when we look at the pattern of these grouping levels in different species of primates against these grades, it's very clear that these grouping levels, the sizes of these different units lie on these grades, not scattered amongst them. So here are data, for example, for Hamadryas and gelada, which are well known to have this kind of hierarchically structured fractal setup. The values of these sit on or very close to specific grades. These are data for chimpanzees, which we now have turn out, and gorillas, which also turn out to have this kind of structure. And here are the data for humans over here. And then these are some guenons, African guenons and colobines from Africa and Asia, which if you look at species which live in large groups and small groups, related species, then they turn out to sit on these grades. So if I can identify the right set, I think this is colobus monkeys This is colobus monkeys in Africa, which live in small groups, and here are procolobus monkeys, which live in large groups in more predator risky, poorer quality habitats. And it looks like what's happening here is to create these larger groups, they're simply holding subgroups together from the standard type. So rather than a group fissioning and half the group disappearing, the group stays together, and that causes them then to sit on these grade lines. So these grade lines act as attractors, and it turns out there's another fifth layer down here. So these are grooming coalitions in these species, what are called neighborhoods, female neighborhoods in the chimpanzee research. Humans, this is the size of your kind of basal social grouping. So only certain group sizes are possible, but as you go up through the layers, so the bonding gets weaker and weaker and weaker and less stable, which is why up here, the Hamadryas and Gelada can form these flexible herds, as it were. And that seems to be the point, is that this fractal structure allows great flexibility without losing social cohesion. And it turns out, if you look at the size distributions for primates as a whole, so this is the average mean species group size for every species of primates, then these turn out to have this fractal structure as well. These are not normal distributions. They turn out to be a number of partially overlapping Poisson distributions, so skewed distributions, but with very strong peaks. And these peaks occur at around 5, 15, and particularly 50. In the anthropoids, there appears to be a grouping somewhere in the middle at about 30. And the same is true of the prosimians, just sit down here at the bottom. They have peaks at 2.5, around about 5, and about 15 again. And that turns out to be the structure of your social network. So this is from our work on human social networks. What we find is this kind of structure. You sit in the center of a series of expanding circles. The smallest one around you has about 1.5 people in it. That's because some people have 2 intimate friends, some people only have 1, so the average turns out to be about 1.5. There's a circle of very close friends, friends and family, remember, about 5 people. About 15 best friends, about 50 good friends, 150 friends. So here's Dunbar's number. And this circle really defines the limits of altruism, it turns out, and emotional bonding. Then beyond that, we know there's a circle of 500, which we call acquaintances. And then beyond that, we know there are 2 more layers in humans, one at 1,500, one at 5,000. But these layers are very, very consistent. You see them in all data sets, and they're driven primarily by how much time you devote to them. So these are the average rates of contact per day for each individual in each of these circles. And you can see this inner core of 5 best friends and family here. You see contact much more often. In fact, you devote 40% of your social time, social effort, and your emotional capital as well to these 5 people, and then another 20% to the 10 people. These numbers are cumulative, by the way. The 15 includes the 5. It's not an extra 15. You devote another 20% of your time to the extra 10 people in this circle here. So that 60% of your social effort is devoted to just 15 people, and the quantity declines as you go out. But those frequencies turn out in humans to be crucial for keeping these layers together. If you don't see somebody at the specific frequency of contact required for this layer, let's say, they will drift down very quickly within a matter of months into the layer below. So these are very, very time costly relationships. We've shown these layers exist in Facebook data. It's a very old Facebook, publicly available Facebook data. So it's from about 2009, I think. So just after Facebook started, people didn't have their sort of full networks on there. But you can see, if you look at the postings in there, you get this layered structure. These are Twitter data. So these are conversations going on within Twitter accounts between the followers. These are cell phone data, national cell phone data. from an entire country. It's again, very large samples. These are our estimates from face-to-face interactions. That's asking people to list all their friends. And here, exactly the same numbers reappear in modern armies. This is the structure of modern armies here that you're looking at. And lo and behold, here are fractal group sizes in the structure of primate social groups. They just sit on these lines. There's something weird and odd about these numbers that makes them very, very stable. And therefore, group sizes tend to cluster around them rather than kind of being completely random. So, okay, just to sum up very quickly, most of these ideas were really discovered by asking why animals behave the way they do, and just keep on asking why, like a child does, and not making any real theoretical assumptions. In fact, sometimes theory gets in the way and distracts us. I think we have to be able to look at what the animals are doing in themselves. As I said at the beginning, using humans to study things we can't easily do in animals, understanding the differences between primates, among the primates and between primates and other mammals was a very important thing. A lot of it has been possible only by collaboration. So collaboration with physicists on the network structure stuff, it's been hugely, hugely profitable. And with neurosciences for the brain imaging stuff, which I couldn't have done myself. And without these collaborations and these contributions, this story would have been much shorter and much more boring. And last but not least, we have to be very, very careful how we ask and statistically test our questions. And most of the kind of attempts to disprove a lot of this stuff has simply been a consequence of people testing thinking they're testing one hypothesis, but actually testing the reverse hypothesis, which is, a completely different question. And it's because people haven't been paying attention to the structure of biological arguments and explanations is really the root of the problem. Okay. And this is my new book, just come out. It's summarized all the human stuff, but of course there's some primate stuff buried in there. So it's just written for the layman, but it has lots of references. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope I haven't talked for too long, but I'm happy to answer questions.
You've been listening to the PrimateCast, a podcast series dedicated to all things primatology and wildlife science, to the conservation of species, and to the sharing of scientific knowledge. The podcast is hosted and produced by Andrew McIntosh, with artwork from Chris Martin and music from Andre Gonçalves. It is brought to you by the Center for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology at Kyoto University's Center for the Evolutionary Origins of Human Behavior. Visit us online at theprimatecast.com and follow our social media feeds on Facebook and Twitter at The PrimateCast. Drop us a line anytime to say hello, to tell us what you think about the show, and to suggest future guests for the podcast.